secular view of looking at things and said it's a oneism. And I made the point that oneism is actually a return of a pagan cosmology, one that's been around for a very long time. We see it today in the form of naturalism. And then I made mention of the neo-pagan remix religion that is so rampant in the West today, which is another form of this secular cosmology of oneism. Now this evening we're going to be looking at the God who is true to himself. And like last week, we're going to begin by unpacking this aspect of the doctrine of God. Then we're going to examine how our secular age has set up something that resists this truth about God. And then again, like last week, we're going to finish by highlighting why a return to this truth about who God is really essential for our times. So, the God who is true to himself. A foundational truth about God, according to the Bible, is that he is the great I am. The great I am. And this aspect of God's being is first disclosed in Exodus 3, which is a key passage for understanding the doctrine, part of the doctrine of God we're looking at tonight. It has a great story behind it. Moses is looking after a flock of goats, I suppose. He's out in the open country. It's pretty barren. I imagine he was probably rather bored. And off in the distance, he sees a clump of bush on fire. And it begins to capture his attention. In fact, he becomes startled as he noticed that this bush is burning up and yet not being consumed. And it's probably a burning hot day, and Moses thinks the sun must be getting to me head. So he goes over to have a closer look, and lo and behold, a voice comes from within the bush. And after that, I would suggest the most remarkable conversation between God and a human person took place. God speaks from the bush, and as part of the conversation, God tells Moses his name. He says, I am that I am. I am the great I am. So God is revealing here that in his divine nature, he has the kind of being that's absolute. Let me put it in a bit of a tongue twister, if I can. God is a being whose is as can be. God is pure being. Or as Augustine puts it, he is an immeasurable and unbounded ocean of being. So being God, he has a distinct and infinite life of his own, and from within himself. And what it adds up to is this: God possesses the kind of freedom where it takes no effort for God to be God. Now, there are two classic articulations of this truth about the doctrine of God that expresses this reality: divine aseity and divine simplicity. Let's look at them briefly in their turn. Divine aseity. Several of my kids, I think before they were 5 years old, asked the great aseity question. You know how it begins? Hey, Daddy, who made me? Well, darling, God made you. Ooh. And who made this whole world? Well, darling, God made the whole world. And Daddy, who made God? Silence. Because no one made God. That's divine aseity. To posit, to assert that God is the source of his own being. As the uncreated one, he is uncaused being. And that means, and this is the doctrine of Assaity in a nutshell, he exists in and from himself. So this reflects that God has a free and independent life of his own, which later in the New Testament is disclosed as a Trinitarian life. So what aseity means is that God is completely self-sufficient. He's dependent on nothing outside of himself for his own existence. That, in a nutshell, is divine aseity. Divine simplicity undergirds and fills out what aseity means. It's a way of asserting that God is what he possesses. So it gets a bit technical, but basically it's saying God's essence is identical with his attributes. So God isn't dependent on his divine attributes to be what he is, as if, say, the idea of an attribute, the ideal of love, somehow existed outside of God that he must then correspond to. No. Divine simplicity allows for the statement, God is love. And that means every attribute that belongs to God is identical with his true being. So, think about it like this. We can rightly assert that God is the living one. We can assert he's truthful, he's righteous, he's loving, he's wise. But the truer revelation of who God is means he's not just living, he is life. God isn't just truthful, he is truth. God isn't just loving, he's love. He's not just wise, he is wisdom. These are all ways of saying that his attributes are identical with who he is. And divine simplicity even goes further, because it says, because God's essence is identical with his attributes, even the attributes that are ascribed to God don't differ in substance. That's the oneness, the simplicity of God. So for God to be good is the same as to be loving, which is the same as to be powerful, which is the same as to be just, which is the same as to be wise. So what this all adds up to is a God who has a being where he's always true to himself. It's impossible for God to be anything but himself. And he is totally consistent to who he actually is. Now that means there is nothing arbitrary about God. I remember when I was quite young, gaining a love of the Greek myths. But what struck me about the mythological stories of the Greek gods and the Roman gods was how arbitrary they all were. So inconsistent, so moody. But the true and living God, being true to himself, isn't like that. He's utterly faithful to his own being. And for us, that means he is trustworthy. He's someone for us to lean on, to depend on, because he is utterly dependable. He's true to himself. Now, this aspect of God's being, and we could say so much more about it, it's utterly unique to him as a divine being. It belongs to the divine nature to be like this. The source of himself, he is what he possesses. And that means to be a creature, which we are, is not to be like this. We are not the source of ourselves. We are creatures made by another and utterly dependent on others for who we are, whether it be our parents or whether it stretch right up in the hierarchy to God himself. So to be a creature is not to be self-sufficient. We don't exist with aseity. And neither is it true that we are what we possess, that somehow our essence and our attributes amount to the same thing. What we actually become as persons over time depends on all kinds of sources that are beyond us. You see this in how virtue is formed in a human person, starting with a child's. And let's say as a child and now as an adult, you can be characterized by the attribute of kindness. Tristan, you're a kind person. I know that. Now, you are never the source of your own kindness. Firstly, you're dependent for a standard of kindness that exists beyond you. So an ideal of kindness, and then you begin to live up to it. And secondly, what creates kindness in people can be traced to sources external to you, to your parents, to a teacher who was kind to you perhaps, or the modeling you see in your local community. So it all adds up to this. No human can ever be the source of themselves in the sense that God is the source of himself. And added to this is something we just have to accept. Because of this truth, there's something inherently unstable about human beings. And especially in terms of how we construct an identity. I've been very taken of late with an academic called Leslie Jameson, who wrote her great book, The Recovering: Intoxication and Its Aftermath. She's an alcoholic, and this book charts her course to recovery. And as part of her recovery, she sees this point very clearly. Part of it was seeing that her so-called true self, which she thought she was in reality plural. She saw she had multiple identities, and it was quite arbitrary how they functioned. She said she's a multi-faced creature without oneness, without coherence, not like God, true of all of us. Okay, that's briefly the doctrine of God, who is true to himself. Let's look now, secondly, at how the secular age has set up something that resists this truth. And I'd suggest we do this because today, broad statement I know, but I stand by it, everyone has become an entrepreneur of self. We're entrepreneurs of ourselves. We're operating today out of the conviction that we can secure our own I am. That it's possible to create ourselves from within. It's premised on the belief that there's enough inside of us to be the source of the self. Something solid enough there to actualize, to be true to. So the general idea is that deep inside me is my truest self, and I have the freedom that allows me to be this. And that's why we're told, don't let anyone else tell you who you are or what you are. Only you can discover that. And one of the highest ethical imperatives for people to live by today is to be true to this principle, that you are the source of yourself. Now that's what I call the modern Assaity project, or the secular Assaity project. Our belief that we can self-create. Now, I think for a number of decades now, this has been the obsession of the West, almost the driving force of our existence. It's hard to think of anything we invest more in than this, self-creation, being our true selves. Now, we have to move through this quickly, but the secular Assaity project, I think, has gone through a number of stages. Let me list them rather quickly. First of all, back in the 1950s, we have the Existentialist Stage. This is put forward by the great continental philosophers who said a lot of great things, but a lot of rotten things too. Now, the existentialists begin with a grand negative. Being and nothingness. That's the starting point. And because we start from nothing, it's up to us to will ourselves into being. Existence, for the existentialists, which is our choices, come before essence, which is our being. You have to choose to be. And that's what our human freedom is for, to will ourselves into being. Now, for Jean-Paul Sartre, this was a zero-sum game. It's you or it's me. Listen to him. He said, man cannot be at times free and at other times a slave. Either he is always and entirely free or he is not free at all. And that's free to choose to be. Now, J.K. Smith, in his recent book, On the Road with St. Augustine, describes Sartre's philosophy of being in these words. He says, this cosmos isn't big enough for the two of us to be free. And the other is a scandal to my consciousness. Intersubjectivity for Sartre is an essential and ongoing contest of assimilation and objectification, of either devouring or being devoured. Even love for Sartre is a contest, a battle of wills for domination. To seduce is to entice the other to give up their freedom to me. This is what this choice to be involves. And it's no wonder Sartre said on the other side of all this, we are condemned to be free. Because we're in this battle where we either devour as part of our will to be, or we are devoured. And if you read the Existentialists, their self-assiety project in this form just looks like tremendous struggle, which is why it never worked for anyone. So that was stage one. And let's say this is so different to God, who, as I said, has the kind of being and freedom in his being where it's no effort for him to be himself. So different from what Sartre is laying out. Now, secondly, around the same time as the existentialists were putting forward their Assaity project, there was something much more positive going on, and I think better fit for a secular humanist ideology. I call these the self-actualizers. The self-actualizers. So here's a positive vision for how we can be self-entrepreneurs. It's all focused to how we can self-cultivate. They use that language. Cultivate brings us into the world of agriculture. How can we grow the self? And so a group of psychologists, people like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, they put forward different ways of attaining self-realization. This is what you have to do to bring your internal potential to maturity. So Rogers believed that the human organism had an actualizing tendency. And if we follow that, our capacities are enhanced. And that moves us to autonomy, he said. And Rogers believed that for a person to achieve self-actualization, there has to be a congruence between their ideal self, who they'd like to be, and their self-image. These two have to come together. Now, it's interesting, you read the self-actualizers, the psychologists, and even they acknowledge reaching this state is extremely rare. Normality is pathology for the vast majority. And it's interesting that, like the existentialists, the self-actualizers didn't hang around for long. They quite quickly went out of fashion. And one of the big critiques was that this effort to self-actualize was no more than theater. It was an act. Which is why the Canadian psychiatrist Eric Byrne called self-actualization the game of self-expression. And he said the thing that's really being pursued here is just feeling good about yourself. Other psychiatrists did the same. They just decimated the self-actualizers, and it didn't last for long. Now that leads to the third stage, and the one I think we're in now. I call these the Self-Authenticators. Here's the most recent iteration of the Self-Assiety project, one we see everywhere today. It's the rise of what we might call the Sincerity Brigade, and we're all part of this to some degree. So it works like this. There's something in me that's all my own. And that means I have to commit to being sincere. Sincere to what's uniquely me. Tara Burton, who I quoted a few times last week, her book, Strange Rights, New Religions for America. She says, I am the only truth I know, telling me what to do and how to live. To be my truest self, I should follow my instincts. My body and my gut know more than my mind, and an unjust and repressive society has held me back from becoming my best self. It's warped my faith in my own abilities and my relationship with others. And I owe it to myself to practice self-care. I owe it to the world to perfect myself physically, spiritually, and morally. There's no objective, right or wrong. Different people in different societies have different moral obligations. I have to be sincere to my truest self. Now, the one place you see the ethic of the self-authenticators operating today is in Disney. You show your kid Disney films, this is what they're getting all the time. All the slogans saying the same thing. Be true to yourself. Resist the crowd. Rise above the masses. Forge your own path. So you parents with young ones, we think, oh, that film's a 15, better not show that to our youngsters, and we just let them have Disney with no critique at all. Now, unlike the first two stages, which I think were quite quickly critiqued from within, I don't think the self-authenticators have been properly critiqued yet. It's still going strong, and there's a lot of energy behind this one still today. But I think the critique would be this. We all seem awfully eager to declare to the world how sincere we are. And clearly the new self-authenticators have to keep asserting their sincerity. We've got to show the world, this is my sincere self. But surely, sincerity isn't something you assert. Sincerity is something which you're meant to be. And I think to endlessly assert sincerity actually undermines its credibility. Which is why, if we could stand way back from it, I think we'd see that the Sincerity Project is rather contrived. And actually the polar opposite of what sincerity really is. I also find it noteworthy that the Self-Authentication Project today has become utterly dependent on the likes of others. Now, we really see this in the world of social media. You need the thumbs up emoji. I love it when I get one of those. Now, this works in what I've dubbed in a book manuscript on this subject, the glass house syndrome. We present to the world this true self that's all my own. But it's from within a glass house, because I need you to be able to see me when I affirm what's sincerely me. So in my photos, okay, those of you know, you say, Andrew, you've never posted a photo, and I never will. But if I did post photos, or in my Twitter statements, okay, I don't have Twitter, but if I did. We need someone who responds and says, you're amazing. That's so cool. It works in what the philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the pleasant pact of coexistence. This is what keeps it going. You affirm me, and I'll affirm you, and this group will affirm me, and it keeps going on, so we get lots of affirmation in the Sincerity Project. Now, all this need for the likes and affirmation of others doesn't exactly ring true of Assaity. God doesn't actually require our likes to maintain his being. He is what he is, and can't be other than that, whether we love him or we hate him. But we, on the other hand, seem to crumble if our Sincerity Project doesn't get enough likes and affirmation. So clearly we're not self-sufficient beings. We are dependent on others for their affirmations. In his book, The Agony of Eros, this philosopher I mentioned, Byung-Chul Han, he makes the interesting point that all this self-expression of our sincerity today has got flattened into sameness. That's his line, flattened into sameness. We're all expressing our uniqueness, but it looks exactly the same as everyone else's. Other people have the same piercings, they listen to the same bands, they watch the same TV shows. It's pretty hard to be unique and sincere. It just flattens into sameness. Now, I'm being pretty harsh about these things, but I think these are genuine parts of the secular Assaity project. We could say much more about it all. Before we move on, I want to briefly mention two other forms of the Assaity project that are around today. And I think we could say these are more extreme forms of it. And as trends, they highlight just how committed we are today to self-creation, and self-creation at all costs. So the first one I want to mention is expressing a self beyond the limits of nature. I'd say up until fairly recently, it was accepted that to be human included having a hardware account that was rooted in biology. So that meant accepting that nature had imposed on your being either a penis or a vagina. And that made you either male or female. That's the hardware account and part of what it means to be a human being. Part of our identity. One of our multiple identities. And the fact that nature imposed this upon us was evidence that we're not totally free beings. Many points of our identity are actually imposed, not self-created. And now in the last few decades, and especially in the last few years, we've witnessed the Assaity project take a new turn where many are defining themselves beyond their hardware. So there are these huge acts of self-creation that transcend things like gender and race. So it's a giant assertion of an I am that goes beyond our biology. Now this is premised on a view of human freedom that begins to approximate God's freedom. Here's the one who's not defined by factors outside of his own being. He's the source of his own self without external constraints. And I think these new ways of self-identifying are an attempt to mirror this kind of aseity. But unlike God, who is himself without effort, this form of self-identification seems to be very labored. And part of the laboring here is the new ethic that's spreading throughout the West. It's called intersectionality. First raised for me a few years back by Jack Harding. First one I heard the word from. And then I looked into it and read the book by Douglas Murray, The Madness of Crowd, a lot about what this book is about. So intersectionality is basically what is incumbent upon all of us to be highly sensitized how everyone around us is self-identifying. We've got to pick up the cues. Be careful what you say. Be careful of your words. That might undermine it. You need to be doing this constantly to make it work. It's hard work. And Douglas Murray says it's impossible work. There's no way we can do it. But it's the only way these new forms of self-identification work, the ones that go beyond the limits of nature. Everyone has to cooperate. Now again, I think this fails to be true aseity, true self-sufficiency, in possession of who we are without effort. It's just not like that. The second, more extreme form of self-aseity I want to mention is self-creating by means of the new technologies. It's really interesting to see the direction of this. Rather than looking within to find our true self, now we have to look outside of ourselves to achieve our full potential. And you now hear the new techno-utopians talking in this kind of language, advocating that humans will only realize their fullest potential by utilizing technologies like artificial intelligence and nanotechnologies to become who they're meant to be. So our acts of self-creation will reach the apex as we engage with these technologies that are beyond the self. Tara Burton says, today's techno-utopianism basically worships human potential and its technological manifestations, including artificial intelligence. So those advocating this path would say, rather than looking inside to reach your potential, we should utilize something which is much more in the realm of the tactile and real. And they would say, consistent to their atheistic beliefs, their materialistic beliefs, that all this interiority that we're focusing on today is rooted in an illusion. Humans have no soul, there is no real self, and there's certainly no divine spark in humans. As Burton puts it, according to the techno-utopian theology, we should act in accordance with our desires and needs and wants, not because there's an innate spark of the divine within us, but because there isn't. So do what you want. Nothing to constrain us. So it's time now to wake up and fulfill our potential by utilizing the machine and merging it with our machinery, our biological machinery. And this is for the new utopians, techno-utopians, the most straightforward way to stabilize the self. Just get serious about the fact that we are no more than biological machines. So why not use our technical know-how for enhancement? That's how we're going to reach our highest point. Welcome to the world of transhumanism. Now, at the moment, the self-authenticators are still going strong. Be sincere is all the rage, but I believe there's good possibility that at some stage in the future it's going to stall. How much being sincere can we do? And I think it's possible that the techno-utopians may be giving us a preview of where the secular Assaity project is going, where it's going to land. Becoming more fully what we are is leaving interiority aside and simply enhance the biology, the bid to self-create from sources outside of us. Okay, moving on to my last point. Why a return to the truth about God is so essential for our times. Now, I've hinted throughout this talk that the modern Assaity project isn't working in its various iterations. All our attempts to be the source of ourselves are failing to deliver. And this effort to self-create, to be entrepreneurs of ourselves, is killing us. Again, as Tara Burton writes, she says, as a psychologist of secularism, Phil Zuckerman told me, one of the biggest problems for secular culture is that you have to cobble together and make it yourself. Now, if you want your kid to have a bar mitzvah, it's all taken care of. You want your kid to go through confirmation class in the Episcopal Church, boom, they're enrolled. If you want to do a secular version of that, good luck. You're on your own. You have to figure it out. Explain it to people. Rent the space. Find people. Figure out how to write up your own program. You're on your own. You have to figure it out. Now, I would suggest that is just becoming too much for us. And clearly, with all the self-authenticating, we're not witnessing more self-stability. Now, I can't give you empirical evidence for that, but I just don't think the human race what year are we in, 2021? I don't think we look more stable than 10 years ago. There seems to be quite something unstable about humans, as there's always been something unstable about us. All this self-belief, all this self-creation isn't working. In fact, we could argue that it's making us crazy, and that's exactly what Chesterton said. A line from his book, Orthodoxy. The men who really believe in themselves are all in lunatic asylums. Thank you, GK. Gilbert always has a line for everything, doesn't he? Now, the Self-Authenticators project is making us crazy because humans are not self-subsistent beings. We simply don't possess aseity like God has it. So as dependent creatures, it's impossible to generate the meaning of ourselves. All our self-creative acts simply don't work. And that's why there's something so unstable and arbitrary in our multiple acts of self-creation. Again, so unlike God in the stability of his being, the one who makes no effort to be himself because he's always himself, where we, by way of contrast, are so wobbly and fragile. Now, through the ages, there have been various prophets who have reminded us how fragile the self really is. And their prophetic words are a challenge right into the heart of the modern Assaity project. I'm thinking about figures like Augustine, the great Augustine, and then Nietzsche. You couldn't have two people more opposed in their worldviews, but they all said the same thing when it came to this. That when we test our identity, what we really see is that we don't know who we are. Nietzsche's famous phrase, each is furthest away from themselves as knowers. We're furthest away from ourselves. And then more recently, the great French philosopher Jean-Luc Marion made the same point in his incredible book, In the Self's Place. Really opened up this particular subject for me. From various angles, he's showing that the self is inaccessible to the self. And he quotes Augustine, who said, I'm a great question to myself. Which I just think is true, so true. Now, this inability for us to know us is so different to God and his self-knowledge. You see, because God is himself without effort, he knows himself to perfection. To be yourself fully and perfectly is the same thing as to know yourself. And the fact that as selves we can't know who we are is a clear sign that we can't become ourselves. It's beyond us to generate the meaning of me. In fact, the more we try to do that, the more we end up destroying ourselves. G.K. Chesterton again said, "Self is the Gorgon." Gorgon? Well, this refers to Medusa and her two sisters, not exactly the pretty ones in the Greek myths. These are ugly, ugly sisters. They have snakes for hair. They're the Gorgons. And the point of the story, if you look at them, you'll turn to stone. Self is the Gorgon. G.K., what are you saying? Well, it's like that with the self. You keep looking at yourself, trying to create and authenticate. At the end of the day, you're left with a stone. You destroy yourself. And for St. Augustine, it wasn't even stone. Because for him, he said the self is a void on its own. The self is a void, and it remains a void until it finds its true source, beyond the self. And that's why it's only in abandoning our attempt to be our own I am that any of us can be secured. Now, the reason for this is breathtakingly simple. Humans are created beings. Not self-created, but God-created. The fundamental truth. It's where Christianity begins. So that makes us derivative from another being, the one who is true to himself. And this God, who has this kind of being that we looked at earlier, is the original. We're not originals, only he is. Now, I like to illustrate this with what's known in engineering terms in my wife's family as a die. This is a specialized machine tool that's used to form materials into an intentional shape or a profile. Now, the die is the original, and everything pressed or stamped out of the die represents the original. It's represented only because the original exists. It only exists because of the original die. Now, the Bible reflects this in its own way. Its anthropology is bound up with what's called the imago Dei. Humans are the image of God. An image is a representation, and a representation is nothing in itself. So said Herman Dooyeweerd, the great modern Dutch philosopher. The reality of an image only exists in relation to the absolute real, the one we image. He is real, we are his representation. And as representations, we only become ourselves in proximity to him. And because of that, all of our attempts to self-authenticate, to self-create, are unworkable and ultimately unsustainable. And that's why the Bible says it's only abandoning our attempts to be our own I am that's ever going to secure us. Now, this is actually what Leslie Jamieson, this academic who's an alcoholic, this is what she discovered and what she talks about in her book, The Recovering. She said, this ruptured syllogism, if I understand myself, I'll get better, made me come to question the way I'd come to worship self-awareness itself. A brand of secular humanism. Know thyself and act accordingly. She asked, what if you reverse this? Act and know thyself differently. Now, this act, as Jameson puts it, was first to abandon her autonomy, to make herself vulnerable to other. And ultimately, we have to do this to the one who is truly himself. Abandon our autonomy and go to the one who is himself and never fails to be himself. And Jean-Luc Marion says he, because of who he is alone the self's place, in the self's place. Jamie K. Smith, in his recent book On the Road with St. Augustine, develops this point. And he goes to Marion and says, Marion rightly comments, this weight of the self, this burden of conversion means deciding between two burdens. That of the self reduced to itself, which is the weight of a dead weight, or that which I would love and which would lighten me, because it takes me out of the dead weight, out of the gorgon, to he who is truly real. And he says this outward upward turn is truly Augustinian. And it's the posture of a dependence that liberates, a reliance that releases us from the myth of authenticity. So humans only overcome the void of the self by giving up their autonomy. And that involves coming to the end of ourselves. And having done that, we then commit to dependent living, ultimately directed to the one who has the kind of nature where he is himself and remains himself, the one who has authentic being strong enough to support our fragile selves. And that is why he is the self's resting place, and why we become ourselves in moving to him. I think this is a moment culturally when the invitation of Christ, the greatest invitation I think we've ever heard, into the modern Assaity project is what we all need to hear. And the invitation goes like this: come to me, all you who are weary and burdened with the dead weight of yourself. And he says, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Here's the light side, no longer the dead weight of self, trying to be the source of ourselves. Coming to Christ is the way to be light in the sense of giving up the burden of self-assiety, of our self-creation projects. And hearing this invitation, following Jesus, gives a return much greater than I think any of us could bargain for. Because Jesus said in the chapter just before the great invitation, Matthew 11:28, he says in Matthew 10:38, whoever does not take up their cross and follow me isn't worthy of me. The whole way to losing the dead weight of self is to follow me. And he says, whoever finds their life, or thinks they find their life, their self, through acts of self-assiety, through acts of self-creation, will lose it. But whoever loses their life for my sake, find the surprise of they find it. They find their life. They find their self in laying it down to follow Jesus. Again, the Augustinian upward, outward turn, which is to the source of ourself in the God who is true to himself. Okay, we're going to leave it there. My 45 minutes is done, and Josh is going to moderate our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm just going to stand here so for the benefit of those joining us by live stream. It's time for a few minutes of Q&A. What I'm going to do is try to ensure that everyone who has a question can have the microphone, so that everyone on the live stream can hear. If you also want to contribute from the live stream, please do feel free to message your questions, and then they will be read out via my colleague John. Do we have any questions? Or indeed comments?
Points of clarification.
Thanks, Andrew. So you mentioned in passing a couple of times virtue, and I was thinking about duty and the place of duty, which we don't really like today, to think that I've got duties. Have you got any thoughts on how that fits into the scheme that you presented?
Yep. So everybody would have heard that question? Good. Yes, so in a sense, Virtue, how does that relate to duty? I think one thing that I can say positively about duty is that it's always in relation to something which is outside of yourself. You do your duty to king or queen or country. So in that sense, it's very outward, externally directed. I think the weakness of duty in the modern period goes back to Immanuel Kant, his famous categorical imperative, that we can create deontic duties that create the common good that everybody just has to fall in with. So in that sense, I don't think duty and virtue are the same thing. And in some respects, we should all abhor racism, but I think the way we're tackling racism today is duty-bound rather than virtue-bound. Because if we took on true virtue as kindness, the one I mentioned earlier, that would deeply impact how we treat people who are different from us. They wouldn't be strangers. We wouldn't rebuff them. So I can see benefits of duty, and in our age, it's quite attractive. But I far prefer virtue. But again, I don't think virtue is ever self-created. The virtues, this is where I like the Greek Romans, the virtues were understood so well outside of the self. There's a great idea of what the virtues were and what they look like, and you try to fall in with that idea, make it shape your character. Naomi, Ian.
Thank you. I think possibly one of the weaknesses of virtue in our own age is this the whole virtual signaling business. In other words, virtue becomes a kind of self-serving exercise in moral vanity, essentially.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to go back really to this criticism of this whole self-project. I think a lot of people, secular people, would see Christianity as being a religion of denial, essentially, being something as fundamentally negative. And they would sort of they would look at all the pictures of great art of Jesus on the cross and see, in a sense, a sort of self-immiseration. So now, how do Christians get across that that is not the case?
Yeah.
That, in other words, you lose your life in order to find it.
Yep.
Which an awful lot of Christians seem to lose their life and then forget about finding it.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I think the great binary of the Christian life is between relinquishment, we have to give something up, and then we acquire something. We get something back, so much more than what we actually gave up in the first place. So you see that actually in Jesus. He gave up his life on the cross, but his resurrection life far outweighs all the mess that was there in the first place. So relinquishment to acquisition, and I think it's stating that the acquisition is so much better, so much greater. And what we think is full life here is nothing like full life. But I don't see that you can ever get to the acquisitive side without the relinquishment first. That's why Schaeffer talked about the centrality of death. But it's for something greater. It's not just the suffering, it's not just the no.
But I think very often, to some extent, Christians have made a virtue of suffering, you know, and a virtue of sacrifice.
Yep.
And in some senses, you know, look at poor me.
Yeah.
And look how good I am, being as miserable as I am.
Absolutely.
And that's a shame.
It is. Yeah, that almost becomes a virtue. Oh, poor old me. Yeah. Then they become whingers. Hi, Naomi.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I actually have a follow-up on that, because I think, do you not think there is also actually a biblical version of self-actualization? Because I think it's because what I notice, especially in specific Christian circles, that if one is aware of this, of what you pointed out, of these self-authenticators, but what follows up on that is that then one has the idea that you have to give up your character or your personhood that makes you, and they then base that on Galatians 2 verse 20, where they say, like, it's not longer me, but Christ lives in me.
Yep.
So I think it's very important, because, so what I mean is then it's a sort of form of asceticism. Like, I have to give up my, like, who I am as a person in order to acquire this kind of ideal. And I think that's very, well, in my point of view, that's very dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So I thought, do you have some reflections on that?
Thank you. It's very, very helpful, the way you've laid that out. Yeah, the New Testament, Jesus never said we die to the self. We die to our self-love. And I think Augustine was very careful to clarify what he meant about this death, this void we are. It's self-love, which is ultimately the problem. Now, we're going to get to that in my next lecture. And we have to distinguish between self-care, which is legitimate, and self-love, which I think, in the Bible's terms, is totally illegitimate. So it's not the self that dies, it's not the human personality that dies. You use the word character. I think character is virtue. So that's not innate to humans. That's developed. That's the habit of the heart to either good character or to bad character. And Christ is totally committed to creating good character. Yeah, the thing about our true personalities being obscured by being in Christ. You could say the same of a marriage. The two become one. Does that obscure the identities of the two partners in the arrangement? And I would say in a good marriage, absolutely not. It should enhance and actually bring both of them to greater light, which is what Paul talks about in Ephesians 5, that Christ died for his bride to make her more beautiful, to make her shine brighter, not to sort of be obscured and be lost in the oneness. So at one level, we go back to last week, I would say onist cosmologies do exactly that. It's all about totally obscuring. So the outline of a person, their individuality gets lost. There's nothing of that in Christianity, and which is why Paul could say, Christ died for me. Just in those verses, he died for me. I have a name, I have a personality, I have a history. He died for me. He knew me, and he died for me. But now in this new arrangement, I'm no longer tied to Adam. So this is where federal headship comes in. The human race either belongs to Adam, we are in him, or we belong to Christ. We're in him. In Adam, we're a void, Augustine says. In Christ, we're alive, truly alive. So navigating our way through this with the right terms is so important. And that question is critical. It's one I heard a lot at L'Abri. I'm covered with Christ's righteousness. What does that mean? Does he see me anymore? Really important.
Got our first question from those joining us on the live stream. I'm guessing this may have as some of its background the debate right now about euthanasia and assisted suicide. I'm just going to read it out as it's come through. The question is, I know that my Redeemer liveth, says Job. Suffering is part of our source, so euthanasia is not good. Do you see a connection between suffering or euthanasia and being true to yourself?
I find that hard to address immediately because I haven't made that connection. I suppose it's possible that some of it could be reflected in sincerity, or how we understand modern sincerity. It's certainly now defined in terms of a human right. So we can self-create and we can also self-end. So in that sense, it fits the picture we're talking about. It's a denial, though, ultimately of Assaity, because God being the source of his own being, he is always giving life to himself. He is a life-enhancing being, whereas this goes in the opposite direction. Interesting question. It requires more pondering. Anybody?
In a sense, that's the irony, that the self-authentication, the self-realization ends up by self-extinction.
Yeah.
In other words, I must be true to myself, which is that I must define exactly the circumstances in which I live, and therefore also in which I die.
Yeah.
And then tragically, you end up getting rid of yourself, or, I mean, not wanting to kind of play down sometimes the ghastly situation that people are in.
Yep.
But nonetheless, it's put by the pro-euthanasia thing as fundamentally, it's my right to decide for myself.
Absolutely.
When my life should end.
Yep.
So it's a kind of tragic irony that that is the case.
I agree. But I would say this, if I wasn't a Christian, if I was a secularist, a pure secularist and a materialist, I would argue very strongly for assisted suicide. It makes perfect sense to me on those terms. But as a Christian, saying, knowing where the source of the self, where the source of life is, I am completely opposed to it. But it depends on your starting point. But when I hear a non-Christian argue for assisted suicide, I disagree with that, but I hear them. I think you were hinting at that too. And if we are just mere biology and the quality of my life is so diminished and reduced, why wouldn't you exercise your right to finish it? So at the end of the day, it's all about your starting point.
In your examples of the secular Assaity, would you say it's more prevalent in Western modern society, or is it spreading beyond that?
Yes, good question, Dave. My sense it is more of a Western phenomenon, but we live in the global age, the media age, where it's much harder to make a clear line between the East and the West. It's part of what China's struggling with at the moment. How do they keep the West out? So I think it is more Western, but I suspect it's spreading like wildfire everywhere. Some of you have been in the East. You've been in the East, spent some years there. How would you answer that question, Josh? Yeah. Anybody else got an insight on? Yeah, good.
So, to a certain degree, for the self to be fully manifest, it has to sort of that the manifestation of self is a partial consequence of its identification with a variety of collective identities.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile that as that's the manifestation of self, and partially the beginning thereof? How do you reconcile that fact with the fact that simultaneously the collective is always necessarily subject to the individual?
Yeah.
Which is, an axiomatic principle in Western society.
Yeah. So, in a sense, thank you very much. So I get your question right, because I think it's a very profound question, if I understood it. Wouldn't be your explanation, would be my understanding. But the self, the individual self, derives a good part of its identity from the collective. I am Canadian. So what is derivative of the other? Does the collective give rise to the individual, or does the individual give rise to the collective? Is that along the lines you were?
I guess it's kind of I guess you could think about it in that way, but I suppose it's a very broad observation, and you can kind of answer it in a multiplicity of ways. But I suppose that would be one derivation to sufficiently answer the question.
A philosopher I absolutely love, a Dutch philosopher, he dealt with this in some detail, and he said the problem is, in the history of Western thought, is there's been this massive argument. Is the one dependent on the other, or is it vice versa? He says they're both dependent on each other, because only God is non-dependent being. So he says you find dependency arrangements wherever you look in the created order. So to say that one is derivative of the other is just a false starting point. And he says we could have undermined thousands and thousands of pages of writing of philosophers, especially in the looking at political science, who really delved that question very, very deeply. Especially in the early modern period, it was really important as they were thinking about the common good. this was the whole thing. Does it start with the individual, or does it start with the collective? How do we become a virtuous society? I'm glad you had. Not many people even ask that question, but I think it's a really fundamental one. Yeah.
Just a quick question from me. You read someone like John Gray, and he begins to question whether there is such a thing as the self. And of course, there's a tradition in philosophy that denies you can really nail down human nature, either generally or in specific. We're all changing constantly, in constant flux, a bundle of perceptions. I don't think we'd want to say that. From a Christian perspective, a person is not just a void, although seen from some angles, there is mystery and there's derivation and there's dependence. What does Christian theology enable us to say positively of the self? How would you summarize sort of a positive account?
Yeah. Well, starting with, we are a creation of a great and beautiful other. So in a sense, recapping, one who is totally stable in his being, who's made us in his image, and that's a beautiful thing. And when we're in fellowship with him, the self couldn't look better because we reflect him. When we're out of fellowship with him, it all just goes terribly pear-shaped. And we do become the void of self, which is Jean-Luc Marignon's phrase, actually happens. We become the Gorgon. And that is the human crisis. So yeah, this is back to your question. The self, the human self, is the pinnacle of God's creation. Nothing else is given this label of the Imago Dei. We are the image of God. Absolutely remarkable. So the dignity of a human self is beyond telling. We need superlatives to describe a human person. But we are badly despoiled because we've left our source. And I think our grand attempts at Assaity to show the truth, they're utterly failed. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's it. Going once, going twice. And I think that's it. Why don't we give Andrew a hand and thank him so much for his labors.
Good, thank you.
Thank you once again for those who've joined us, to those who've joined us by live stream and to those who've come to the Round Church. It's wonderful to see you. Wonderful to have you joining us. Just to say, next week, same time, same place, nothing is happening.
Yes, the void.
It will be a void. The third talk, the final part of our series, will be on November the 8th. It's also a Monday. It's 2 Mondays from now at 7:30. Not BST, but we will officially be Greenwich Mean Time again, won't we? It will be winter time. So slightly different time arrangement. So please take note if you're joining us from another place, and that may affect you. I believe it's called UCT these days, isn't it? Universal Coordinated Time. So that's November 8th. Until then, we wish you well. The live stream is going to cease. And those who are with us, please feel free not to rush off, but to chat and to stay. Thank you very much.